Hey everybody, welcome back to the Mixing and Mastering Workshop series. Today we are doing compression part 2, or I should have probably called it dynamics processing part 2, because today we're not only talking about compression but also about gating, otherwise known as expanding. So expansion, gating, this is another form of dynamic processing. So processing uh, based on the variations in volume of an instrument. Um, and we're going to be talking about that pretty much at the end, because it's not that complicated of a concept, and it's not as important of it's not as yeah it's often used, but it's not like as up there in like the most commonly used and most important and most technical and difficult to get your head around processing units that we tend to be using, like EQ and compression and stuff like that. It doesn't take as much. It's not as challenging to learn how to use it, so we're not going to spend that much time on it. Um, so last week I actually neglected to mention a term that I should have defined at the beginning. We didn't use that term during the workshop, but it's something that it's a word that is often used in place of the word that we were using last workshop. So I was saying attack, and attack is the same as the word that we're now needing to define, which is the word transient. Um, they're two different words to describe the exact same thing, the onset of a sound. So when a sound hits, that is the attack, otherwise known as the transient of a sound. Some engineers call it the peak or the peak transient. These are different terms to describe the exact same thing. So it's the onset of the sound, the beginning of the sound. So transient is, it sounds like a very technical and academic almost term, um, but I will say that this is actually the way that we're using it is a colloquialism. It's not the technical meaning of the word transient. It's one of the technical meanings. But if you look up the Wikipedia page, for example, you're probably going to get a completely different definition of what a transient is, as opposed to what we're talking about now. Um, I'm going to quickly switch over to our Reaper screen, and I'm going to show you a kick. So this here is a single kick drum hit. This is a waveform. Um, and just to give you a quick background on how waveform diagrams like this work, this is a visual representation of what your speaker is doing when you are listening to music. So the line in the middle is the neutral position of the speaker. So um, if your speaker is stationary, it's like this. If it's pushing air forward, it pushes itself forward. If it's pushing the air backwards, it pushes itself backwards like this. And in a waveform graph like this one, when it goes up, that's when it's pushing the speaker forward. When it goes down past that middle point, which is the neutral position of the speaker, it goes down into negative, so it's like pulling the speaker backwards into the speaker frame. And then backwards and forwards. And you can see this is basically a vibration. This is a very rapid process. This is basically a visual representation of the movement of the speaker itself. So I just want to talk about now what how how we're kind of breaking this up to uh, think about it in attack, otherwise known as transient, and sustain. So I'm just going to quickly do that by splitting this sound. So this part, just going to undo these automatic fades that it's doing. This part of the kick drum sound is the attack, otherwise known as the transient. That's how we tend to talk about it. This first, or maybe more like this. This first part is like the transient. It goes from neutral up to the positive, down to the negative, back to neutral. That's the first. That's the first wave, full cycle of the wavelength of the. Sorry, it's the first full cycle of the wave that is the kick drum, right? Of the sound wave that is the kick drum. Apologies. So this is the transient, and this part here is the sustain. So when we're processing dynamics, it's listening to these different parts and it's processing them. So It's mostly listening to the loudest part of the sound and it's reacting according to the loudest part of the sound, but it's going to affect how these two parts of a sound interact with one another. So the way that the attack interacts with the sustain. So I could go here and like turn down the attack, for example. And in effect, now we have like a much quieter attack and it's the same volume as a sustain. So in effect, I will have compressed the signal of the attack. I will have compressed the signal of the drum. So that's basically how a compressor works. It's reacting to the loudest part of the sound, and it is turning the attack down and keeping the sustain in place. And then afterwards, we're turning up the wet gain, which is turning up the overall sound of the instrument. Now with a quieter attack and a louder sustain. So that's just to get that out of the way. So transient is the onset of the sound, otherwise known as attack. I also want to talk about 3 different kinds of compressors that have completely different sounds. The first one I want to talk about is the VCA compressor. So these 3 different compression types are based on hardware units. So when you have like a hardware compressor, like a physical electronic device that you plug in your sound source into and it compresses that sound source, they fall into these 3 broad categories. So a VCA style compressor has a very specific and unique sound. An opto compressor, otherwise known as an optical compressor, has a very unique and distinct sound, and the same with FET compressors. So these are basically words that describe components that are inside of the compressor, and those components are what give it the qualities that it has. They tend to affect the shape of the attack and release curves, and they tend to affect the shape of the knee and the ratio as well. So let's start by talking about FET compressors. And I'm going to give you this example on the drum bus. So I'm going to solo the drums. I'm just going to turn it up a bit. And I'm also going to load in a very famous, what do you call it? Hardware compressor, which is a VCA style compressor. So this is it. This compressor here is a digital modeling of the hardware unit that we're talking about. This is probably the most famous VCA compressor in history. You will have heard this compressor like innumerable times because it's often used on drums. Basically, yeah, I think this was made in the late 70s, early 1980s, and it was heavily utilized in that time because it was very cheap and it gave a very punchy sound for drums. So you can see here, this is where the ratio is. So we can turn the ratio to whatever number we want. Its default is 4:1. So that's the one that we tend to be working with, I'm sure you've noticed. You can set the threshold and the output, which is the makeup gain. So let's play this. Let's play these drums, and I'm going to slowly bring up the compression. You can hear it's absolutely slamming it right now. The most important thing to think about when you're listening to this, and the reason why it's so famous for the application of putting it on drums, especially, is because it actually lets through like a bit of the snappiness of the attack. It's taming the attack, the transient, but it's actually allowing some of it through in a really musical way. So it's taming it while maintaining a certain amount of it that's keeping it controlled. And even at high compression levels, like what we've just got here, it's still like it sounds really vibing. Like it sounds like really energetic. So this is often used on drums, a VCA style compressor. So obviously I've got it it's pumping and breathing like quite hard. That's just to give you an idea of how this compressor sounds. And I'm going to contrast that with optical style compressor, otherwise known as an opto compressor. So LA to A, oh, maybe I should just write 2A. Yeah, here we go. This is a digital modeling of a very famous compressor called the LA2A. This is an optical compressor. The way that this works is really interesting, actually. Optical compressors basically have a light inside of it and a optical resistor. So the brighter the light shines, the more resistance is applied to the circuitry. So the more it turns the signal down. And so the louder a signal is, the brighter the light shines, because the signal is actually put through the light itself. And so the louder the signal is, the brighter the light shines, and the more it's turning down. And here we only have two parameters to work with: peak reduction, which is how much compression do you want, and gain. This is how that original model was set out. So that's why they've got that. I'm going to raise the compression. And now I can hear a completely different style of compression. Much more subtle, much more transparent, even though we're compressing quite hard. So what we can hear is that the transients are much more tamed, the release is much slower, and that's giving it a certain kind of quality. Optical compressors also have a very smooth knee, and that's what contributes to its subtle character. So this might be not useful for a song like this because for drums especially, it's not going to make the drums sound as punchy and exciting as they should, I think. But if we're doing like a jazz band or something like that, it would be probably much more suitable for the drums because you don't really, especially if it's like a softer jazz kind of band, you probably don't want to have a really aggressive sounding compressor that's really going to grab at the sound like the previous one that we had, the VCA style compressor. The previous one was actually called the DBX 160. DBX is the name of the brand, 160 is the name of the model. I'm going to show you one more kind of compressor, which is the 1176. Maybe I'll just write 76. A lot of these, because they have to license, if they use the real name, they have to like license it from the company that makes the hardware unit. So they often don't give the full name. They'll just write the last few numbers. So this is a model compressor that is a FET style compressor. So this is a different circuit again. Basically, this is the last of the main three types of compressors that we tend to be using. Actually, I will show you one more after this. There is one more that we probably need to know. But just for now, these are the main ones that you would probably be using on individual channels. So this has a different style of layout again. It's got input and output. So that means that we don't get to control the threshold. This is a fixed threshold compressor. So we don't have a parameter that we can, change that's changing the threshold. We can't turn the threshold down to get more compression. We have to turn the input up while we turn the output down to compensate, because the threshold is at a fixed level. So if you want more compression, you have to actually turn up the input. So it's turning up the input into the threshold. And that's when it's going to be compressing. Here we have the ratios. We have a 1-to-1 ratio if you want no compression and you just want to run it through the circuitry itself, because that actually does change the sound, just simply putting it through the circuit without any compression, just by the nature of the in the hardware world, like putting it through like all the different components that are in the unit does change the sound, often makes it sound a little bit sweeter and a little bit warmer. But yeah, we got 4-to-1, which is what this unit tends to be used for. Like often it's just a 4-to-1 ratio. And then 8-to-1, 12-to-1, 20-to-1. And then you've got a setting which is all, because in the real unit, you could actually just kind of like push all of these buttons in at the same time, like all of the different ratios, and it would multiply all of them together and effectively become a limiter. Okay, so let's have a listen to this. Okay. We're hearing this, again, having a different sound to the other ones. Sometimes it just cuts through a little bit too hard. So you can actually make the attack faster. This compressor is famous for having a ridiculously fast attack. The fastest setting on this compressor is 20 nanoseconds, which is 0.02 microseconds. That's an extremely fast attack time. So if you really want to grab that transient out of a drum, you can use something like this. I personally am not a fan of this compressor. It's an extremely famous compressor. Like, it's used a lot on voice and stuff like that. A lot on bass guitar as well. It's never really sat right with me for some reason. It's just a matter of personal taste. But yeah, let's just cycle through and listen to each one of these and listen for the characteristics of each of them. So I'm going to start with nothing. I'm going to put in the first one, which is the VCA compressor. It's a very aggressive sounding compressor. I'll take it off. Now there's no compression. Now I'm going to put in the LA2A, the optical compressor. It almost sounds like there's no compression at all. It's very natural sounding. But it also kind of like takes away the life of it a little bit, in my opinion. It just it's not really sounding like as lively as the other one. And now let's listen to the 1176, the FET style compressor. Cool. So there you have it. 3 very distinct types of compression, all modeled off of real-life compressor units. When we are using like recomp, you can kind of mimic these things a little bit. Yeah, there's like some presets that you can also use, and a lot of the time these presets won't have the names of these compressors, but they will have the characteristics of them kind of built into the way that it's set up for that preset. So yeah, you can go through and just kind of like mess around with presets and like reverse engineer stuff. That's a really good way of learning how to use these things. But if you're trying to get your head around compression, the best thing to do, in my opinion, is the trick that we learned last week, and also try your best to mess around with the different parameters and really listen to what it's doing to the sound, especially when you have it compressing more complicated sound sources. Okay, so all right, so that's the first part of the workshop today. Let's move on to talking about some new stuff. I want to talk to you about a kind of compression called sidechain compression. Sidechain compression. So at the moment, up until now, we've been talking about using compressors on a track, and the compressor is listening to the track itself and applying compression according to what it hears from that track. If we use the sidechain input of a compressor, we can actually feed a different track into that compressor, so that now, instead of listening to a single track and compressing it according to what it's hearing from that one track, it's now listening to a completely different track that's been sending into it, but it's applying compression to the track that you've put the compressor on. So I'll give you an example. I'm going to do this a little bit quickly, so don't worry if you're not going to get this immediately. No one's going to really know what I'm doing just now. I'm going to explain it in depth in just a moment. Actually, no, I won't use this. I'll use the Pro C 2 because it's got a nice user interface. Now I'm going to feed in a kick channel. Cool. So now we're going to listen to the kick and the bass. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to full screen this and make it so that first let's make it so that it's listening to the bass and affecting the bass. So you can see here you've got the waveforms of the bass guitar itself. We're listening to the bass and the kick drum at the same time, but the compressor is listening to the bass and applying compression to the bass. You can see every time it gets past the threshold, it's going to turn the bass guitar down. And now I'm going to change it so that it's actually going to be listening to the kick drum, because I've just wired it so that the kick drum is now being fed into the sidechain input of this compressor. So now the compressor is not listening to the bass guitar, it's listening to the kick drum and applying compression to the bass guitar in accordance to what it hears from the kick. So now it's going to be compressing every time a kick drum hits. So you can hear every time that there's a kick drum, you can see here it's ducking down the volume of the bass guitar. So why would we do this? Why is this a useful trick? A lot of the time, there's going to be instruments that occupy the same frequency range, and they're going to mask one another. A prime example is the one that we're doing right now. A bass guitar and a kick, they're both bass instruments. They're occupying the low frequency of the audio spectrum. And as a result of that, they're going to be masking one another to a certain degree. We can use EQ so that the where the kick drum's fundamental frequency is, the bass guitar has a notch there or something, or just a bell that's like dipping just that part, so the kick drum isn't masked and it's crystal clear in the low end of the kick drum, but the bass guitar still has all the other frequencies. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is using a sidechain compressor like what we're using right now. So now we've got the kick drum feeding into the compressor, so the compressor is listening to the kick drum and applying compression to the bass guitar in accordance to what it hears from the kick. So effectively, every time the kick hits, the bass guitar ducks down. And what that means is the bass guitar doesn't have as much volume every time that the kick drum is playing to mask the kick drum, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. So frequency masking occurs when two sound sources are occupying the same frequency spectrum, same part of the frequency spectrum at approximately the same volume. They tend to just compete with one another and muddy each other up, mask each other a little bit, obscure each other's sound. And now you have it so that they're playing, but they're not playing at the same volume at the same time. So every time the kick hits, the bass goes down, and then when the kick is gone, the bass is up. So you have this kind of ducking and balancing. This is like an automated kind of ducking system, so that every time the kick is playing, you're only hearing the kick drum. And anytime the kick isn't playing, you're only hearing the bass guitar. So you don't have to cut out the frequency in the bass guitar. That's the fundamental frequency of the kick drum to make the kick drum sound cleaner. Now you can just actually keep them both sounding really strong, really bassy, but they're not going to mask each other, and they're not going to also compound on top of each other and chew up your headroom on the master bus. So this is a trick that we can use. So how do we do that in Reaper? I'm going to now turn this compressor off, and I'm going to do it with recomp, because you can do that with that. So I'm going to load recomp in, and I'm going to undo what I did before. So I'm going to turn this back down to 2 channels, and I'm going to take this off. So, okay. So here I have my kick master channel. And what I'm going to do is this part of the track. So the track is kind of like split into 2 parts. This part up here is your plugins. And then you got like a partition. And this part down here is your sends. So you can send this track to other tracks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click, hold, and drag to the bass. And when I let go on the bass track, it's sending the kick track to the bass track. But what happens now is if I press play, if I turn the solo off of this, and I've only got the bass guitar soloed, but now we can hear the kick drum in the bass channel. So that's not what we want. We actually want the kick drum to go into the side chain of a compressor. So here's where it gets a little bit complicated and a little bit confusing. But if you follow this exactly, it's going to sound right. So what we're going to do is we're going to click this, this button here. This is the routing button. Click that, it opens this box. So here we've got a bunch of information, but the most important thing for sidechaining is this part here, track channels. How many channels does this track have? Right now we've got it set to 2, which means it's a stereo track. That's the default in Reaper. I'm going to click this box, this drop-down menu, and I'm going to click 4. So now we have 4 tracks in this channel. So that means here we've got the stereo, which is the bass, because the bass is coming through 1 and 2, because it's just a mono signal, so it's going to be equal on the left and right speaker. So left is 1, right is 2. And what I'm going to do is this send that we've made with the kick, I'm going to go down here. We've got audio from 1 and 2, so that means that it's taking it from the kick channel, because the kick channel has 2 tracks. It's another stereo track that is just panned center, so it's the mono track. And it's going to be sending it to 1 and 2 of the bass track. So instead of sending it to 1 and 2, we're going to send it to 3 and 4, because now we have that option. Because we've just changed the bass master to have four tracks in the channel. Because we set this to 4, we have now the option of sending to 3 and 4. So that means that the kick is going to be sending to the side chain of the bass. So now we're not going to hear the kick in the soloed bass track anymore. But we can see the kick drum as a meter, because now we have four meters here. So we have 1 and 2, which is the bass. It's mono, so they're the same volume. We have 3 and 4, which is the kick. So we've just effectively routed the kick drum into the side chain of the bass. We're not going to hear the kick drum in the bass track at all. In the bass channel, I should say, just to keep it consistent. I'm opening up Recomp, and now we can see here this part of the compressor, which is detector input. Detector input is another word for sidechain input. The most common way of talking about this is sidechain. Detector is just another word for the exact same thing. And right now it's got main input, left and right. Left and right, otherwise known as 1 and 2. So basically it means just the bass signal itself, because it's like the bass signal is going into 1 and 2. Left and right is the same thing. So now it's just listening to the main input. We can use auxiliary input, left and right. So now it's going to be listening to the the kick drum. So auxiliary input is is what we've sent to it. So it's sending into the side chain of the compressor now. So if you use the auxiliary input, it's now going to be listening to what track 3 and 4 of the bass channel is hearing. So here you can see the meter is no longer showing what the bass guitar is doing. It's pumping up and down at the same time as the kick drum is. If we put it to main, this is now listening to the bass guitar. Okay, so we can make it a hard limiter with a ratio of infinity to 1. We can make it so that every time the kick drum plays, it's going to turn the bass guitar down. just turn the attack and release up. Now if I solo the kick as well, we don't really hear that the bass is compressing at all, because sidechain compression is basically the way that our ears are working is like every time the kick hits, we're listening to the kick drum, right? We're not listening to what the bass guitar itself is doing. We're only listening to the kick drum. So we're not actually going to notice that there's any compression happening at all. The bass guitar sounds identical to us. So I can even like unmute I can disable that sidechain compressor entirely, and it's going to sound identical. And I'm going to enable it now. Sounds exactly the same to me. So off. And on. So what actually is changing is the definition of the kick drum. That's what we can actually hear a difference in, but not the bass guitar, because every time that the bass guitar is playing without a sidechain compressor on it, that's, ducking down every time the kick plays, every time the kick plays, we're just going to be listening to the kick anyway. We're not going to be listening to what's the bass guitar sound like while the kick is playing, because that's not where our attention goes. Every time the kick is playing, our attention immediately goes to the kick drum. But now that we've done this, the kick drum is going to have more clarity and much more punch as a result of not being masked by the bass guitar, and it's no longer going to be compounding in the master channel. So that's something we can do. So I'm going to keep that on because I like the sound of sidechain ducking on the bass guitar. It makes the kick drum sound much nicer. So to me, that sounds like both the kick drum and the bass have plenty of low frequencies in it, but I can really hear the punch of the kick drum now. It's a very subtle thing. Don't worry if you can't hear it that well. It's just one of the tricks that we use. Another thing you can do is if you have a vocal that you really want it to be really crystal clear, but you have another instrument that is occupying the same frequency range as the voice is, and it's at the same time as the voice, and it's kind of muddying up the voice, but you don't want the voice to be too loud, you can use a sidechain compressor on the voice. You can use the sidechain compressor on the instrument that is clouding up the voice. So for example, you have like synthesizers or something like that that have that are occupying the same area as the voice. You can make it so that the voice is going into the sidechain of a compressor that is applied to the synthesizer channel, and every time the singer is singing, it's ducking down that synthesizer channel just a little bit, like 2 decibels or something like that, just to make it so that it's much more obvious in instruments that are like not in the bass region. So yeah, like 2 decibels or 4 decibels or something like that. It's going to sound like plenty. It's going to move it out of the way of the voice only when the voice is singing, and anytime the voice isn't singing, it's going to be right back up to the level it was at before. And it's a really subtle and transparent way of making room in the mix without having to like go in and like tweak the faders and volumes of everything, automating things so that they're always like, doing it, like ducking out when the singer is singing. So this is a way of virtually having a machine do it for you. So that's something that we can do. So in this song, there's no other sidechain style compression that I would be doing. I hope that I've explained it well. If there is any questions, if there's any confusion, just go back and listen to it again. If there's still more confusion, I'm going to find more resources so you can watch like more videos and stuff. There's plenty of people that explain how to do this on the internet. But yeah, so I've just kind of like demonstrated it briefly. I hope it was clear, but yeah, let me know if there's any need for further clarification. Okay. Now I want to talk about another style of compression, which is called multiband compression. So up until this point, we have been using what's called broadband compression. Broadband compression means that it's applying compression to the entire sounds, to the entire spectrum of the sound. So it's going to be applying compression from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. So it's not discriminating based on the frequency range. It's just applying the exact same amount of compression to the entire frequency range. Multiband compression is something we can use if we only want to compress a specific part of a signal. So say, for example, you want to really compress the high frequencies of a drum, for example. Like say, for example, you have your hi-hat is too aggressive in a drum and you want to tame it, and you don't want to compress the rest of it. You don't want to compress the low frequencies of a kick drum or the mid frequencies of snare drum or anything else like that. You only want to compress the highest frequencies, which is like the cymbals and the hi-hats or whatever. You can use a multiband compressor and only use a high band for it. So I'm going to show you on a drum. I'm going to show you with Pro MB because it's got the nice graphics. So here we have a frequency analyzer. This is a multiband compressor. You can see the dynamics of all these different frequency ranges are slightly different. So for example, you can see when the kick hits, it's booming up in the low frequencies. But if we look up here, we can see the hi-hat is being played twice as often as the kick drum is. So if we want, we can compress just this high band. So I've just clicked this, and I'm just gonna use these controls down here. Actually, wait, I'm gonna make this smaller because you're not gonna be able to see that. So here we have threshold, range, attack, release. And down here we've got ratio, we've got knee, we have a few other parameters that I'm not going to mention. So I'm going to just compress just the high frequencies and show you what that sounds like. So now we've got the high frequencies really taming. It's kind of making it sound a bit more silky. We can also change the range so that, like, I mean, with the other compressors that we've been using up until this point, we haven't had this parameter to work with. This is just setting like how much is the maximum amount of compression that it's allowed to do. So right now it's set to -6, so it can't do more than 6 decibels of gain reduction. It can only do like up to 6 decibels. So it can do less than that, but it can't do more than that. So we can have it so that it's like -30, which is like virtually, you know, down to silence. So now it's sounding really dull because it's compressing the high frequencies so much. I'm just turning it back up. So this is just a general example of how you can use a multiband compressor. You can also go through and like add a bunch of different bands and compress each one differently. I'm going to show you how this sounds on the master now, because this is where you have the most amount of frequency content, and so it's going to give you the most amount of effect. So if I press play, we're seeing the full mix here. So I'm going to put a few different bands, and I'm going to go through and compress each of them. So now I've got 5 different bands. I've got one for the bass. I'm going to have it up here. I've got one for the low mids. I've got one for the mids. I've got one for the high mids and one for the highs. And we can compress these at different amounts with different settings, different attack release times, different ratios, different knees, and different thresholds. So we can actually compress them completely uniquely. So if you have like any signal that you just want only a part of it to be compressed one way and the other part of it to be compressed a different way, a multiband compressor is a nice way of doing it. Say, for example, we want to compress the low frequencies a lot. We can go through and compress that now. So I'm just going to put some, I'm going to dial it in a little bit. Now I'm going to do the low mids. I'm going to actually slam the low mids just for the sake of example. Like, the mids, I'm going to compress only a little bit. The high mids, I'm going to compress quite a lot as well. And the highs, I'm going to compress just a touch. Okay, so now I've actually applied a bunch of compression to the track, but we've used completely unique settings for each of these different bands. And what that's going to do is it's going to be compressing in a much more transparent way to a broadband compressor, if you want it to do so. Because we have so much harmonic content and they all have completely different dynamic qualities to it, it makes more sense to compress them individually. It's just one of the tools that we can use. There's also, like really, really high quality broadband compressors that you can use on master buses. But yeah, this is just an example. This is one of the tools that we can use. I'm going to show you how we can use it really effectively on a voice, because sometimes you want the voice to sound really dynamic in certain areas, but to be tamed in other areas. I'm going to just take this off of the master bus, and I'm going to scroll over to the voice. Okay, say for example, we want that, we want her to sound brighter, but we don't want it to sound like with the quieter parts. We don't want it to sound, we want it to sound brighter in the quieter parts, but not as bright in the louder parts. Let's try that. So we're going to put this in there. Actually, now that I've shown you the Fab Filter one for the graphics and all that, I'm going to show you the Reaper one, which is Re-X Comp, R-E-A-X Comp. And I'm going to go just to the highest. So this is from like 6.3. I'm going to bring this down to like 3.5 kilohertz. And I'm going to compress everything from 3.5 kilohertz and above. So here we can see all of the different parameters that we can work with. And we can go through and just one by one dial in the different settings that we need. So let's have a listen to it. So we can bring the threshold down. Okay, so now we're getting some compression. Okay, so this is actually automatically making up for the for how much it's compressing. So I'm just going to turn that makeup gain off, automatic makeup gain off, and we're just going to be hearing just it compressing and not compensating for it at all. Okay, it's compressing quite a lot. So we're hearing it duller. Okay, so we heard in that line there, it was very dark sounding until the end of the line, because she's starting to sound she's starting to sing quieter at that point. And so because she's starting to sing quieter, it's not compressing as much, so the high frequencies are coming back up.
And boy, I'll give you all I got to give.
Okay, so we can see when she's singing the louder parts, it's compressing by like 10 decibels. And in the quieter parts, it's only compressing by like 1 decibel or something like that.
And boy, I'll give you all
10
I got
decibels,
to give.
it's 1.5
Baby,
to
be mine
something like that.
now. You're everything this world could be. The reason I believe in love.
Okay, so that's just a single example. I'm going to show you what we can do if we're wanting to tame just the S's and T's. So this is a very common thing to do. This is something called de-essing, and I'm going to use this same plugin to do it. So just because we've been using multiband compressors, a de-esser is basically a compressor that there's two ways that it can work. One way is what we're doing right now. So it's just going to be compressing just the S's and T's and only those high frequencies of those. And the other way is it can make it so that every time an S or a T is playing, the entire frequency spectrum is being turned down as opposed to just the highest frequencies like we're doing right now. So first we'll do it this way. I'm going to see how it's going to sound if we just compress it with just this compressor on the highest frequencies.
And boy, I'll give you all I got to give.
So I'm going to make a really high ratio, and we're going to find a part where the singer is going to have an S or a T.
And boy, I'll give you all I got to give. Baby, be mine now. You're everything this world could be.
Okay.
The reason I believe this world could be. This world could be.
All right, so here we have her saying this world could be.
This world could be.
Okay, so without this,
This world could be. The reason I believe in love.
it's going to sound like that. If we bring the threshold down,
This world could be. The reason I believe in love.
now we have a compressor that's only compressing in that part, and it's just every time that she sings a S or a T, it's going to be ducking that down, and it's going to be leaving it untouched every other time. Let's try to find another part, maybe in the first bits.
I don't need no dreams when I'm by your side.
Okay, so here, have a look at how much it's compressing. So we've got 2 meters, and then there's a red meter in the middle of it, and that's going to be showing us how much it's compressing.
I don't need no dreams when I'm by your side.
So -6 decibels when she said side, the S part of side. And so it's just dropping down that high frequency by 6 decibels when she sings side. We can do the same thing. I'm going to disable that. I'm going to do it with recomp. So now we can look at this detector input section. So because the detector input is just the main input, we can actually change how it's hearing that main input itself. We have a low pass and a high pass setting. So we can make it so that it's only going to listen to the low frequencies. We can make it so that it's only going to be listening to the higher frequencies. So for the sake of de-essing, we're going to be making it so that it's only going to listen to the highest frequencies. So 6 kilohertz and above. So this is the frequency range that is where the S's and T's are. 6 to 7 to 8 kilohertz. That's usually where it is for most people. Different people have different peaks for their S's. We can even see it if we have like a spectral analyzer. If we do this,
I don't need no
look up here.
dreams when I'm by your side.
So I'm by your side was about here. So actually she's got a really high one. It's above 10 kilohertz for her.
I don't need no dreams when I'm by your side.
Yeah, it was actually at around 12 kilohertz that her sibilance is. So let's make it so that it's up near that. So I'm going to make it so it's like about 9.5 kilohertz high pass, and the low pass is going to be set exactly where it is. Just to clarify, this isn't going to affect the the final product of the sound. It's only we're not high passing up until 9.5, kilohertz, and we're just only going to hear the air of the voice because we've cut everything out. This is just affecting what the detector input hears, what the sidechain input hears. So now, instead of the compressor listening to the entire sound and applying compression to the entire sound, it's only going to be listening to a tiny portion of the sound, what we've determined with the high pass and low pass filters, and then apply compression to the entire frequency spectrum of the sound according to what it hears of that tiny segment. So we can see in the meters on the left here.
I don't need no dreams when I'm by your side.
So you saw when she said side, it peaked up a bit. I'm going to bring this down. We're going to use a high ratio, like 6 or 8 to 1.
I don't need no dreams when I'm by your side.
Okay, and now we can hear that it's compressing the entire frequency spectrum when that S is happening. So I'm going to just speed up the release because actually I don't know if you heard that, but when she said side, I think it's here.
Every moment
No.
I'm by your side.
It sounds like the "-ide" part of side. It kind of like was still compressing when the S had already disappeared. So we don't want that to happen.
I'm by your side.
So if we speed it up.
I'm by your side.
Okay, now it's recovering quick enough for the "-ide" part of side to be left untouched.
I'm by your side.
It's still turning down the S, which is really good, but it's keeping the rest of it intact. So this is a de-esser. It's literally de-essing. So that's what that is. Okay. So much for compression. I'm going to keep that on there because it's necessary for this track to have a de-esser.
I'm by your side.
Sounds really good. So now let's move on to expanding or gating. Gating and expanding are the same, two words for the exact same processing. It's the opposite of a compressor, but it is a dynamics processor. So a compressor is turning down, it's controlling the dynamics in like a negative way. It's like turning it down. An expander is it's listening to the dynamics and making it more dynamic. So say, for example, this drum, I'm just going to put a compressor on it and obliterate the sound. I'm going to put recomp, and I'm just soloing the drums. And I'm going to give it a really high ratio, really fast attack and release, so it's basically distorting it. And I'm going to bring the threshold down. So we've really deadened up the drums. Like there's no attacks at all anymore. Like there's too much compression. It's over compressed. Let's say, for example, we have a track that's like, for whatever reason, it doesn't have enough dynamics and we want to give it more dynamics. We can use an expander. So I'm actually going to use, for the sake of the graphics, I'm going to use this. I'm just going to make one big band. And I'm going to put this into expand mode. So down here you can see compress and expand. So this is just two options of the same thing. And I've just made it so that the range is above the neutral point. So now I'm just going to demonstrate it for you just so you can hear it. I'm going to have it so that it can turn it up by like 5 decibels every time it hears something go past the threshold point. Let's make it even louder. So without it, it's got no attacks. And with it, It's bringing those attacks back in. So it's literally the inverse of a compressor. Instead of listening to the dynamic content of the instrument and then turning it down according to the input, it's turning it up according it's turning the signal up for the same durations as your attack and release. And so it's got the exact same parameters as a compressor. It's got a threshold, so you can determine at what point it's going to turn up the signal. It's got an attack to determine how quickly it's going to turn it up. It's got a release for how quickly it's going to turn it back down to its neutral position. And it's got a ratio that tells you how much it's going to turn it up by. So let's make it super fast attack, super fast release, like as fast as it goes. Let's slow down the release. And now we have all of the snappiness of the drums is now coming back. Of course, we've done this in a very destructive way. We've overcompressed it, and then we've brought the dynamics back in with an expander. But this is something that you can do. Okay, so let's show you another way you can use an expander. And I'm going to do this one on the vocal track, because in the vocal we have a lot of spill. So we have all this time between a vocal, between where the singer is actually singing, where there's basically nothing happening, but we can hear the drums.
Every moment takes me to paradise.
So say if we want to get rid of those drums completely because we don't like all that spill, we can use an expander as a noise gate. I'm going to use this, and I'm going to put in, instead of making it so that it turns it up above the what it was at before, I'm going to make it so that it's actually turned down to silence every time that the singer is not singing. And we're going to see if we can make it so that the threshold is set to exactly the volume of the quietest part of the singing.
Every moment takes me to paradise, and I need to hold you, warm you in my arms and melt your fears away.
Okay, sometimes we got the background noise cutting through, but this is basically as good as you can get a noise gate to work when you've got like a bunch of background noise and stuff like that, like when you've got like actual drums and like horns and stuff like that playing. But this is just to give you an example of like how a noise gate can be used to clean up a sound. It's often better to use this when you have like background noise that's like a computer fan or something like that. Like say for example it's summertime and your computer fan is going crazy, like mine is right now, and you want to get rid of that out of your vocal. You can actually make it mask out by using a noise gate so that it turns the signal down to virtually zero anytime that the singer is not singing, so that the background noise is not actually feeding into the microphone too much, into the track itself too much. So that's something we can do. In a track like this, I would be much more likely to go in and edit. I would just go in and like cut, like physically just like cut it out. So I would probably, let's turn that off completely.
I don't need no dreams when I'm by your side.
So here, there's no singing anymore. And then here, she's singing. So I'm just going to cut it like this. I'm just using S. So you click on it and you press S and it's going to split it there. I'm just going to cut this out as well. What's here?
Yeah, ooh, baby.
I'm going to cut that out too. So this is just an example. So now I've got this cut so that everything that she's not singing for these three parts are cut out completely.
Yeah, ooh, baby.
And so now we're going to hope that once we unsolo it, it's going to be
I don't need no dreams
sounding
when
like there's no
I'm
drums
by
in
your
between.
side.
Cool. Let's hear it.
Yeah, ooh, baby.
Cool. Sounds all right to me now.
I don't need no dreams when I'm by your side.
So we've effectively gone in and manually cut out the noise. So this is what I tend to do myself. I'm not really fond of using noise gates because of how imperfect they are. I always go in and cut things myself because I can like speed up the playback of it and just really rapidly go in and just like split, cut, edit, and just make it sound as clean as possible. And it doesn't take that much time. Like maybe 50, like for example, if I have to like mix a band, like the toms, they're not playing the toms that often on the drums, but there's a lot of like ride, like the ride cymbal or something is like spilling into it. I'll just go in and just like cut up the toms so that only when the toms are playing, that track has signal coming out of it. Everything in between is completely cut out because the ride cymbal is going to be like washing in and out of the microphone. So it's going to make the ride cymbal sound really weird. And I only want the ride cymbal to be captured by the room mic and the overheads. So I just go in and just cut it out of the toms like manually. It doesn't take that long, like 15 minutes or something like that. Just sort of like concentrate and do that. It ends up giving a really good result. Yeah, so that's noise gating. Sometimes people do that to make things sound more like punchy and aggressive. You can do it on a snare drum, for example. So we can set it on a snare. We can even do it just on the snare top. Because the snare bottom is just like the chain sound. It doesn't actually have that much spill in it. But the snare drum itself has a lot of hi-hat in it. So a lot of the time you can go in and like use the noise gate for that because the snare drum is being played so often, you probably need to gate it. Let's see if there's a, there's a regate. So that's the free Reaper plugin that we can use. And I'm going to see how we can work this. Okay. So this is actually a pretty easy one to use. It's just got the threshold here. So the threshold is like set so low by default that it's always on. But as you raise the threshold, it's going to start cutting things out. And now we have it so that it's just only opening when the snare drum is playing. So because it's a snare drum, I want the attack to be pretty fast. So like 3 milliseconds is very fast. Let's hear what it sounds like with 0 milliseconds. If it's not distorting, it's going to be all right. Okay. I think 3 milliseconds sounds better than 0, so I'm going to keep that like that. Hold literally means when it's opened it, how long do you want it to hold for before it starts closing it again? So you can have it at 0, so it just immediately is like closing the gate again. But you can actually have it hold for a while so that like it can get more of the snare drum sound. So let's slow down the hold and see what it does. Okay. So now we're hearing more of the tail, like the sustain of the snare drum. So this is at about like 100 milliseconds. On 0, it sounds like really short and choppy. At 100, sounds like this. So you got more of that sustain, and you don't have the hi-hat in there anymore. And actually now you kind of don't have enough hi-hats, so that's pretty funny. We can turn up the overheads to get the hi-hats back in there. Yeah, there's plenty of hi-hat in that, so we can turn this up. And that's really nice because actually it's got a much nicer hi-hat sound in there. It's like a much more crispy kind of a sound. So now we've taken it out of the snare microphone and we've poured it back in on the in the overhead channel. So that sounds much better. So that's one way that I would actually go in and use a noise gate. I often also use it on a kick drum, on a kick master, because I want the kick to be really clean. Like you hear this like kind of like after every kick, there's also like a kind of like a almost like a slapback, kind of like a woofing kind of sound. I find that in a lot of drummers is a thing. It's basically because like the kick is hitting and then it's resting on the kick head, which is a thing that a lot of drummers do. So I like to clean that up a little bit with a noise gate. So probably need more sustain. Cool. That sounds good to me. So that as opposed to, so here when it's like got it without the noise gate, it's like doom, 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 doom. But with the noise gate, it's like do, do, do. So it's got that more like consistent, it actually sounds like a more clean kick drum. It doesn't have that like slap back kind of womp sound. So yeah, that's another way you can use it. And so we can unsolo that. We just have a much cleaner drum sound as a result of that. We just gated the kick and the snare drum a little bit, and it sounds much better. So that's usually as far as I take it. You can also do multiband gating. So say, for example, the snare drum, if you want actually the sustain of the snare drum to be kept, but you want to gate the rest of it, let's take this off. You can use a multiband gate or multiband expander. Like this one, there is no Reaper version for this one, unfortunately, but you can use the FabFilter one for this. It's very easy to get these plugins, by the way. You can put just a single band on the highest part of it. So let's just listen to where the hi-hat is. You can see on the spectral analyzer, it's basically right here. I'm going to put it into expand mode. I'm going to make this smaller so you can see it. I'm going to make it so that it's going to be turning it up only when the snare drum is hitting. But because it's listening to this frequency area and turning it up according to what it's hearing of this area, it's going to be turning up the hi-hats every time it hears it. So we can actually open up this panel and get, we can like open up where it's going to be listening to. So instead of listening to the high frequencies, let's make it listen to everything that's not the hi-hat. So now it's not listening to the hi-hat, it's only listening to this part of the sound and turning up the higher frequencies according to what it hears in the lower part of the sound. Of course, I'm sure, you know, like most of you don't have these plugins, but if you don't and you want them, let us know, we can help you. But yeah, this is all, yeah, this is gating, expanding. That's basically like everything for dynamic processing in general. I mean, like we can just use the gate for this one, just for the sake of using free plugins. Just, you know, take the multi-band expander out completely. But yeah, and now we have it. So that's all the compression that we need to do in this track. So to sum up, we've used a sidechain compressor on the bass guitar so that it ducks every time the kick drum hits. We've got a de-esser on the vocals, so that every time the singer is singing an S or a T, It's going to be ducking that down as well. We've gone through and we've explained what a transient is. We've gone through the three main types of hardware compressors and, thus the digital modelings of those, the optical compression, the FET compressor, and the VCA compressor, and how they all sound a little bit different and they're more suitable to different applications. And yeah, we've spoken about multiband compression, so a compressor where you can specifically compress different isolated bands. And we talked about noise gates and expanding. Um, so yeah, it's been a long and content heavy session. Um, I got to say, it is quite challenging to do these workshops when I'm not physically face to face with people and I'm not interacting and like hearing questions in real time. Um, but yeah, I hope that people are still able to get something out of this. If people want more help with the concepts we've talked about, please email or use the Discord. Um, and yeah, like I can answer the questions in text, and if not in text, I can also try to answer them on a face-to-face like Zoom call if we need to do that. I really want to make sure that everyone is getting the most out of what I'm talking about here, um, so that everyone can feel like they really understand the things that they need to understand to get their music to where they want their music to be. So yeah, I'm happy to help like 100% of the way until everyone is like feeling 100% comfortable. So yeah, sorry again that we had to do these filmed workshops instead of the live ones. We'll be back to live this coming Sunday. So yeah, I hope everyone had a good time, and I'll see you all Sunday. Bye bye.